Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. Pleased to see you here. I'm Stephanie Paulson. I'm an associate with the Health and Gender Practices. We're really happy for you to join us today, where we'll share some findings from the landscape study evidence related to shifting social norms to advance women's economic empowerment. And women's economic power and gender equality generally. And we'll also be having some panel discussions to share practical experiences and learning in implementing social norm change activities related to the approaches that will be shared from the evidence presentation. For those of you who are here in the room, just a few logistics. There are washrooms in the back on the right-hand side here behind you. And there is water and coffee in the back on there. And I think we can move to the agenda now. Just so you know, this is a hybrid event. So we've got here in the room, and there's also participants online as well. So this is the agenda for today. We will learn a little bit about our gender and youth practice. And then the social norms research presentation, the landscape evidence that I mentioned on social norms to advance women's economic empowerment. And then panel one, looking at proven approaches social norms, which will cover household methodologies as well as male engagement. And we will move into panel two, discussing proven approaches to shifting social norms, looking at both group-based collective action as well as gender analyses and social norms diagnostics. So we're really excited to have these discussions and to present this evidence with you. And we hope that you'll find it informative and interesting. At the end, we'll shift to some closing remarks and a networking reception, which we hope you'll be able to join us for. At the end of each panel, as well as the presentation, we will be able to take 1 to 2 audience questions, both from online and in the room as well. So you will have that opportunity. And now I am very pleased to introduce to you Janice Stallard, our Vice President, who oversees the gender, youth, and economic growth practices. She has more than 25 years of international development experience, including 13 years on inclusive finance, competitiveness, gender, youth, agriculture, and evaluation programs. Her overseas positions have included senior management roles for various USAID-funded projects. Over to you, Janice.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. And it's so nice to have you all here today. I see some faces that I've met before, as well as new faces. So welcome. And to all the people online, we're just really delighted to have you here to attend our learning event. It's our first one for the year, and sort of post-COVID learning event on shifting social norms to advance women's economic power. And so I think that the title says a lot in itself, and it represents who we are as an organization. So Banyan Global, you probably know, we're a women-owned small business. We've been working in the space of gender and social inclusion for many years. We work in this space that looks really inclusively across not just the gender and youth activities we do, but also across our 5 practice areas, which include health, male, economic growth, and gender youth. And we're really proud of the work that we've done in this space. And we're going to share some of that with you today. So when we do this work on our gender and social inclusion and social norms work, it's really important that we take that by looking at partnerships with local organizations. Our partnerships with local partners, our partners, really reflect our approach to building local capacity, but also really understanding what their priorities are for their country. And so we work with them to implement programs, but also build their capacity around these complex topics. So our social norms work specifically, and you'll learn more about it today, really is always based around research. We do cognitive research to identify behavioral drivers around social norms. And then very importantly, we measure that work so we can talk about the impact of what we've done. We were really honored when USAID approached us to conduct a landscape analysis on advancing women's economic empowerment and social norms. And we're going to be presenting those findings for you today. We also have an executive summary over there on that table, and there's going to be soft copies made available to you. So importantly from this study was that we looked at proven, promising and potential practices around social norms and women's economic empowerment. And the presentations today have that framework that we're really going to be talking about the proven practices for social norms and women's economic empowerment, something that really has not been explored that much. And we hope that this information that you see today and learn about really helps and inspires you to really take this really very complex challenge on and carry forward and advance the work that we've been doing. And we're so pleased to actually have online with us Dr. Charlotte Britt, who conducted and led our social norms work landscape study for USAID. And so I believe she's online with us, coming all the way from California, which is where she resides. And I'll just do a brief intro for her. So Dr. Charlotte Britt has over 20 years of experience applying a gender equality and social inclusion lens to international development programs. She's led GESI analysis, research, project design for USAID, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and a range of NGOs and consulting firms, including many assignments for Banyan Global. Dr. Britt holds a PhD and an MS from Cornell University in International Sociology. So with this, I turn over to Dr. Britt. There she is.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janice. I appreciate that introduction. So today I'm presenting a brief overview of the Advancing Women's Economic Empowerment Social Norms Landscaping Study, which I wrote for Banyan Global. This was written to support the learning agenda for USAID's WE Community of Practice, Women's Economic Empowerment Community of Practice. And I'm really delighted that this study is now published and available to everyone. I was very excited to have this opportunity to dig more deeply into the interface of social norms and we, because for many years, much of my work has increasingly attempted to take consideration of gender and social norms into consideration and to better understand and identify the constraints and opportunities that they present. The landscape study builds upon and is very much indebted to the many scholars and researchers who have advanced knowledge on social norms. It drew on key informant interviews and many reports, studies, assessments, evaluations, and articles. Basic seminal work by a host of researchers and development practitioners, many of whom are or have been involved in key norms-related networks and projects such as Passages, Align, Emerge, and See. Now, for the landscaping study, as Janice mentioned, we focused on proven, promising, and potential practices. Those identified as proven were defined as ones with clear beneficial effect and strength of evidence. And this was based on what we could find in the literature. Multi-country analyses, peer-reviewed articles, randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental studies, external evaluations, and or several individual or regional studies that indicated similar findings. The 4 identified proven practices will be further discussed and elaborated upon in the panels which follow, and I'm very excited to hear from the other speakers. So this slide that's up is it basically offers an overview of what I'll be discussing very briefly. Next slide, please. Social norms are broadly understood as implicit and informal rules that define what is acceptable and appropriate behavior. They influence behavior, what individuals do, collective attitudes, what the group thinks or feels and individual beliefs regarding the behavior and attitudes of others. Now, unpacking social norms and realizing positive shifts that change gender discriminatory beliefs, perceptions, or narratives can be integral to advancing women's economic power and gender equality. And I think that case is made very well in the landscaping report. Next slide, please. Now, gender norms and social norms are often conflated, and that's not surprising because basically gender norms are a subset of social norms. They focus on appropriate behavior or actions based on gender identity. They limit the extent to which women participate economically and how they benefit from the economic growth that they generate. They also affect men, gender norms. They're also constraining for men. Gender norms, norm constraints to we are strongly correlated with norms regarding the acceptability of work in specific sectors and activities, mobility and respectability, and care responsibilities, including domestic divisions of labor. Next slide, please. So this table provides an overview of different motivations, terminologies, and associated explanations or definitions that underpin social norms. It's adapted from a 2019 study by the Institute for Reproductive Health's Passages Project. Norms reflect unwritten codes of conduct and imposed moralities, with motivations informed by individual, social groups or society, and combinations of these. So it's, you know, they're influenced in multiple ways, especially reference groups are those people whose opinions matter most to the individual or to me for a particular related to a particular behavior and or context. Norms are reinforced by sanctions or rewards that create barriers to change. As individuals comply with normative expectations, the norms strengthen and become embedded in both formal and informal institutions, often shaping unequal access to assets and resources and curtailing freedoms such as voice, power, and sense of self. This impacts the lived realities in which people live, learn, and engage economically. Next slide, please. But we know that social norms can change and do evolve over time. Even the social norms that can be entrenched, especially the gender norms, which are considered sticky. You find that a growing number of studies provide evidence that positive shifts can and do lead to increased economic opportunities and agency, and more equal divisions of care and domestic work. These are all highlighted in the evidence presented in the social norms landscape report. Next slide, please. So here are, these are examples of tools and data sources that can provide guidance on identifying norms, assessing the strength of sanctions, and recognizing circumstances in which norms may be shifting or weakening. This information is critical because it can help monitor social backlash to mitigate the impacts of stigmatization, violence, and other forms of sanctioning, which is obviously and of course very important to do no harm. National and cross-national data sets and surveys also provide useful information for measuring changes at an aggregate level, including the prevalence and strength of norms in different settings over time, and the extent to which norms are distributed. Next slide, please. So this diagram is from a chapter by Rachel Marcus in the 2021 edited book, Women's Economic Empowerment, Insights from Africa and South Asia. Now, Marcus argues that two main sets of norms affect we: norms that relate to gender and economic activity, and broader norms that influence behaviors. This framework offers an overview for understanding how gender norms combine with stereotypes about men and women's capabilities in ways that affect human capital, livelihood opportunities, and time use. And I found it very helpful and insightful for the landscape study. Next slide, please. So what are some of the social and economic implications? So norms that disadvantage women in the economy include the allocation and devaluation of care work, generally unpaid, not considered work, and disproportionately undertaken by women. The overrepresentation of women in the informal sector, and stereotypes that suggest women are less capable than men. Now, discriminatory gender norms dictate women's economic roles and time use activities and shape their access to employment, networks, and information. They also influence how different types of skills and work are valued, affecting prices, wages, and the benefits gained. For example, low rates of female participation in the labor force can suggest that inhibitions caused by gender norms are actually more of a potent motivator than the possibility of an income that could provide economic stability and financial independence, largely due to perceptions of what is appropriate work and fear of sanctions. These constraints to economic participation disadvantage men and women. Next slide, please. So these are some of the drivers of normative shifts that emerged out of the literature review. However, I just want to emphasize that these are not meant to be viewed or implemented in isolation. These are strategies that are undertaken, but they tend to be part of a multi-component intervention that combines gender transformative social and economic approaches with facilitated reflection and critical analysis among family members, peers, community members, and local leaders. Next slide, please. I'll just briefly touch on these because, as mentioned, we're going to be hearing about these more in detail. The four proven approaches that were identified as part of the landscape studies were household methodologies that combine facilitated dialogue, critical reflection, and goal setting. The most well-known of that is gender action learning systems, but there are others that's also called GALS. Male engagement through entry points that appeal to men's self-interest and positive masculinities. This includes reflecting on conceptions of masculinities to shift these from toxic to positive definitions of what it means to be a man, including benefits of more equitable distribution of household tasks, childcare, and cooperation in productive and economic activities, and group-based collection, action, and learning. Examples of these include village savings and loan associations, producer organizations, self-help, and other groups which increase productivity and financial inclusion. And then the ever important context-specific groundwork, gender analyses, and norms diagnostics that help to identify and assess the strength of norms, related barriers, and potential pathways for facilitating positive shifts in perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. Next slide, and this is the last one. In summary, key recommendations drawn from the literature and elaborated in the landscape report include the importance of integrating norms transformative strategies and approaches into all design and implementation to improve outputs and outcomes. And this is important even when not the central objective. Conducting context-specific assessments to identify facilitating or constraining factors. As mentioned, those gender analyses and the norms exploration and analysis tools that give us insight into strengths of norms and whether there's been any change or there's an opportunity for normative shifts. Engaging men and boys as potential champions and allies. Again, use entry points that appeal to men's self-interest and positive masculinities, which focus on positive traits and healthy behaviors that benefit families and communities. and qualitative surveys, inclusive of vignettes to help identify, measure, monitor, and evaluate changes and respond adaptively as needed to do no harm and mitigate risks of unintended consequences. Now, the beauty of hypothetical vignettes is that they tend to focus on questions about perceptions of what others do, rather than having respondents speak to personal experience as a way of exploring perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors. And this tends to encourage more open responses because people aren't identifying exactly what they think or believe, but what they think other people think or believe. Supporting research and analysis to assess right-sized approaches that better inform replication and scalability. There are just a limited number of comparative and comparable studies, and this hinders identification of right-sized interventions shedding limited light on what needs to be done vis-a-vis duration, intensity, numbers, and costs or budgeting. Facilitating normative shifts with new information, well-informed messaging, and deliberations that correct misinformation and misperceptions and offer positive alternatives or new norms to replace harmful and discriminatory norms. So, as mentioned, yes, positive shifts can lead to increased economic opportunities and agency, and the effectiveness of these can largely depend on how the change is promoted. And one way to counter misperceptions is to correct misinformation and offer alternative or new norms and information. Support facilitated discussions and or trainings for staff to analyze perspectives and biases and reorient mindsets. Staff may hold the same gender norm biases or beliefs as project participants, and it's important to analyze and reflect on these to support positive normative shifts. And investing in longitudinal analyses to gauge sustained impact as part of program monitoring and evaluation to increase evidence of what works and is sustained over basically the long durée. So that's we can move on to questions now if we have time for them. I thank you everyone for listening. And I encourage you to take a look at the Social Norms Landscaping Report for deeper and hopefully better insights into all of what I've just briefly presented. Hello?
Thank you, Charlotte.
Oh, okay.
On the evidence around norms and gender norm change. Do we have any questions in the room or online? It looks like we have an online question. How are you reconciling the passage's largely ego-based reference group centered definition of norms with a more sociological definition?
Well, I'd like to have the person who asked that question maybe to elaborate further on exactly what they mean. I'm not sure if I agree with the way the passage's definition was defined there. I'd be interested in having a little bit more insight into what exactly the person who asked that question is meaning.
It may be referring to the passages project, which you also referenced.
Yeah, definitely. As I mean, I'm not going to go into sociological nuances in this. The focus of this study was to look at social norms through the lens of advancing women's economic empowerment. I look at and define in that work, definitions of social norms and the differences between them and different ways of understanding how social norms change, but I don't try to split hairs over the passages definition and versus reference group. I will say that reference groups are hugely important, and they're people whose opinion matter most to the individual are the social group, and it's not always local leaders. It can be peer groups, it could be influencers, and that there are studies that have shown that especially vis-a-vis media and use of media to help shift norms, that this can be tremendously influential. So I realize I probably didn't answer the question, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Would you like me to elaborate, or is that what your answer is?
I guess in the interest of time, let's leave it at that. Are there any other questions?
It's like we have another question from online. What measurement strategies would you recommend to measure change in behavior versus mindset or attitude?
Right. Well, there are norms diagnostics out there, and those really help in terms of determining what the strength of the norm. There's CARE's Social Norms Analysis Plot Framework, or SNAP, and that focuses on qualitative and quantitative measurements of how empirical and expectations and injunctive norms may shift over the course of an intervention. And it incorporates those hypothetical vignettes that I mentioned in the presentation as a qualitative tool to explore gender norms and in discussions. And it's really aimed at understanding what is considered typical behavior in a community, what are the consequences for transgressing these, and whether those sanctions deter rule breaking. There's also the Oxfam's social diagnostic tool, which it's a set of participatory tools and exercises. So I would encourage the person who asked this question to look at that. And these exercises are for understanding the social norms, perceptions, and expectations that shape, constrain, or promote different behaviors. This can be introduced in as little as 1 and up to about a 3-day workshop format. And then the Institute for Reproductive Health Social Norms Exploration Tools, or SNET, is a participatory learning and action approach. And it offers tool guides for users in gathering information about the most relevant norms and groups of individuals who influence those behaviors, such as reference groups.
And thank you to the audience online for their questions. Well, thank you for this fascinating look at the evidence base around shifting social and gender norms to improve women's economic empowerment. And thank you to the audience for their questions. I think your presentation emphasizes how important it is to integrate norms transformative approaches to address the inequities and power imbalances. So now we will transition from this presentation from Charlotte to our first panel discussion. We have Morgan Mickle with us, who's a senior program officer in Banyan Global's Gender and Youth Practice, as well as Brian Heilman, who is the Deputy Director of Research at Equimundo, formerly Promundo, as you may know. And Malini Patel is a Senior Associate, also with our Gender and Youth Practice, and she will moderate our panel.
Talking earlier, it's wonderful to have people in the room. So thank you all for being here. So we're going to talk about the first two proven solutions, which are household methodologies. And again, I'll remind you, they're interventions that utilize facilitated dialogue, critical reflection, and goal setting to change intra-household dynamics. And we'll also talk about male engagement, which are interventions to promote positive masculinities. Historically, a lot of the work on male engagement has been around intimate partner violence, but more and more the work has grown and there's more recognition of the importance of male engagement in advancing women's economic empowerment. So Brian, thank you so much for being here. I think the audience is really going to enjoy what you have to say. Equimundo is a leader in male engagement space. How does your organization think about men as partners in women's economic empowerment? And what have you learned in terms of ensuring that men's interest and commitment to gender equality work continues?
Totally. Thank you so much, Melanie and Banyan team and everyone for the invite. I suppose we may be recognized as a leader, but the first thing to say in terms of how we think about this work is just that the work is always strengthened and really like relies on partnership in the local communities where we're working, right? Like Equimundo is a relatively small full-time team. And so we're always working with amazing partners on the ground where an actual the session may happen, although those of us based here and who are doing more of the supervising would have brought years of experience of what works in different locations to bear on a particular curriculum or approach to the program. I guess just to echo a lot of what we heard, we're trying to change things that are seen as normal, that are entrenched for, ages old kind of normal practices. And we've really found that you can't do that unless you directly talk about it in those terms, unless you actually say, hey, in this community, it seems like it's normal. Like you kind of expect everybody around you and you expect that they expect you to make decisions this way or to divide up household labor this way or whatever, that men should do this, women should do this. And to put the jargon name on it, we want to take a gender transformative approach, which is that we actually name those gender norms, name the concept of be a man, masculinity, women should do this, men should do this, and bring people in at that initial ground level of starting to see gender in their lives, starting to see these different expectations and reckon with it in their own ways. And when we do that, pretty much everywhere, we find that despite women doing quite a lot of the productive labor in household businesses or at home, even if they are working, that a lot of times family, like financial decision-making power, that empowerment factor sits with men. And so kind of the women's economic empowerment projects that are our ancestors a little bit, we're kind of hitting a wall sometimes if the men weren't at least somehow involved. You even have these examples where like a village savings and loan program that was working specifically with women, some of the early evaluations, they might have shown positive financial outcomes, but there's also a few where it actually led to like increase of IPV in the home because, men felt like this important domain that's under my normative control should be, is happening without me. So we kind of need them, the good, bad, and otherwise, to follow on the journey as well and find their own ways to embrace more equitable decision making. So that's our work, is how do you call them in? And then I guess that gets to the second question of how do we get men to actually care, want to be involved in this stuff and to stick around with it? There's some stuff that we've learned there. I think kind of a positive, engaging framing of everything really helps. Aren't you invested in the well-being of your children and your family? I always say this, but fatherhood, even in the US, let alone in all these places, the idea of fatherhood kind of cuts across the culture war, so to speak. Like a lot of men, especially in a newer generation, to speak of it that way, like want to be more involved in the lives of their kids than maybe, not to like shame anyone in my family or whatever, but past generations did. And that it exists alongside folks still holding relatively restrictive ideas in other spaces. So fatherhood has proven to be an area in. Now, why does that matter for women's economic empowerment? Well, because if who's doing domestic work, who's doing childcare, who's doing all of that unpaid care work, labor in the home is predominantly women, which we find normatively it is. That's a significant barrier to women's labor force participation or taking on other things, or also just keeping that work as undervalued and appreciated. So we found some success in bringing men in that way. And I guess the other thing that we've learned about how to keep them engaged and get them engaged is that it's tricky, and men kind of want to be celebrated. There's a lot of lingo about, the men as champions, like you could participate in a program for one afternoon and walk out of it being called a champion man for gender equality. And a lot of times we're maybe a little too willing to have that really low bar. You're the super dad of the millennium if you care for your kid for one day or whatever. And there are examples, unfortunately, where engaging men initiatives kind of rely on men's power and kind of seek to reinforce that. So you also have to be careful, like in finding ways that men are attracted to, that it isn't just further aggrandizing them or increasing their sense of power. So that's why I don't know if we have anyone from the Men Engage Alliance online, but I think the Men Engage Alliance, who's a long-term partner of ours, has done such fantastic work of creating accountability guidelines for work within this field. How do you go about the engaging men side of things in a way that is absolutely feminist aligned and not kind of giving undue credit where it's not earned, or pursuing outright, moral objectives.
And you've brought up some really good points, local partnerships. I mean, these norms are local.
Sure.
They're very, very driven at the household level, at the community level. And we really need to look at risks, and shifting power has a risk component. And so, and it's great that you guys are recognizing this. And these are nuanced things. There isn't one answer that's going to apply in every situation. And I think we need to be very thoughtful and nuanced about that. Well, and some of that is drawn from research that we do. So as the Deputy Director of Research, what studies are you currently excited about and that you think would be really helpful for women's economic empowerment?
Totally. Well, I feel bad for Morgan not getting a chance yet, so I'll go quickly. Equimundo and again, dozens of partners every other year release our State of the World's Fathers report. The newest one, 2023, just came out this summer. So I brought our little infographic version of that report, which is a shoots and ladders game with some of the ups and downs of work for equal care around the world. There's a bunch of them you can take, and with the QR code to the full report on the back. That's a cool one. I mean, if you follow that kind of theory I was sharing before about if we get men engaged in fatherhood, and that means they're doing more care work and more domestic work, and we're achieving that equal care in the home, that is a fundamental driver of economic equality, right? We're talking about here. And also something I've been involved in my whole career for 15 years is this International Men and Gender Equality Survey. The acronym of that is IMAGES. We're up to 50 countries where this household survey, often nationally representative, has been conducted. And there's just such rich data you can draw upon in there if you're designing an economic empowerment program in a certain country, to understand baseline levels at which men and women agree with some of the restrictive ideas about household economic power. So this is an opportunity we had only earlier this year to combine, for the first time ever, do a enormous cross-country 30+ countries analysis and show them all in a million data visualizations that I made. So this one is not on the table, but come look at it. And the shoots and ladders is. Thanks, Melanie. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. These reports are really useful. I know in the women's economic community, we're always looking at these. I think our online participants, we dropped some links in for you, so you'll have access to it. And again, in the room, you'll have it here. Thank you for doing it. The community thanks you, and we're looking forward to future years. Morgan, we're going to turn to you and household methodologies, and we're going to go back and forth a little bit here. What do you see as the value of household methodologies for social norms change? And why do you think they're so effective in shifting women's economic power?
So great. Thanks, Melanie, for that question. So I was the gender and youth technical lead on the Feed the Future Ethiopia value chain activity. And under that activity, we did have a gender and youth action plan And within that, we found that in the food security and agriculture sectors in Ethiopia specifically, that women and youth had limited access to resources such as credit and land, decision-making authority, as well as leadership opportunities. And while their specific roles may have varied from region to region, both women and youth remained marginalized compared to male adult counterparts. And some examples of this might be time poor due to household responsibilities in the home and on the farm that left less time for income generation. And so as a result of limited access to productive resources, decision-making authority, and time poverty, women actually achieve yields of 35% less than males, despite performing 70% of the farm work. And so we know from the presentation from Charla that norms can disadvantage women in the economy, and that discriminatory gender norms can dictate women's economic roles and time use and access to employment and networks, information, income, assets, and others. We also just heard from Charla that transformative and relationship level interventions have the strongest evidence base. So household methodologies have demonstrated that they're not only effective, but they also lead to sustained shifts in social norms. This can lead to improved relationships and cooperation within households and between partners, more equitable workloads, expansion in economic opportunity and increased income, as well as reductions in gender-based violence. So the value is that household methodologies have helped open up conversations for families and communities like farmers in Ethiopia to discuss, challenge, and shift social norms.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this example in the ag sector, because again, these methodologies can be used in any of the sectors we work with because social norm impacts all of our development outcomes. So it's really great to hear that. At a later time, I'm going to poke a little bit more about the sustainability because I do think this is really important. But right now, I want to talk more about what types of household methodologies have you used?
Yeah, okay. So there's several types of household methodologies out there. One that people are probably familiar with and that Charla mentioned is GALS, which is the Gender Action Learning System. And that's a participatory approach. It aims to transform gender roles and relations, to reduce inequalities between men, women, and youth and households. It also can be done with community orgs and in the broader community to increase household income and well-being. So we actually use GALS in a different Feed the Future agriculture project in the DRC. And it was especially useful in the post-conflict setting where relationships had been disrupted by war and political unrest because it helped to strengthen social bonds and trust. However, in Ethiopia, we actually used what's called the transformative household methodology, or THM. It was developed by Syndicao Ethiopia. It's a tool and a facilitated activity to create awareness of inter-household gender relations. It's peer-to-peer dialogue based. It focuses on identifying roles and responsibilities of all the household members, their access to and control over resources within that household, and their related benefits. So it's a little bit different than some household methodologies that focus on the society and the community, because THM specifically focuses on the household itself. And it has been particularly effective in rural contexts where education levels may be lower. It uses images, it doesn't require reading. It's pretty simple and easy to understand. And actually at the very end of the event, we'll show an instructional video of THM actually being conducted.
Great. I'm going to want to ask about what are the actual outcomes you saw, but you've given us a great kind of landscape of these methodologies and how they were used. So I want to turn to Brian to talk about some of the methodologies that Equimum uses, specifically your journeys of transformation. And what's your main social norms approach and what successes and results have you seen?
Sure. Well, Yeah, again, I can remember when Journeys of Transformation first was created once upon a time in Rwanda. CARE, our partner in this particular project, was running a village savings and loan initiative and finding that, you know, probably some of the men in the community were grumpy that they weren't involved. And so we came up with the right approach to maintain the women's economic empowerment goals of the VSLA right at the heart of it, but find the right way to bring men into some, not all, sessions and really start at the start with the gender transformative approach. I was saying, like, the very first session is not, okay, guys, so why do you like control all the financial decision-making power? No, it like starts at, okay, let's talk about what men do. Like, be a man. What does this mean to you in this setting? Like, what are the expectations put on you by your parents, by the others in the community? How about for women? What are their household roles? That's a whole session, you know, with men and women together. Some of the really fun sessions that were originally designed either in Journeys of Transformation or another that was a little bit more fatherhood focus that we did. And I've actually seen this one practice in a village in Bangladesh as part of a Journeys of Transformation program, is like showing, you have men, 5 different men doing 5 different domestic work tasks. And then one by one, they have to hand the task over to the next person. So by the end, it's one person doing 5, you know, traditionally feminine coded household work. He's cooking the rice while he's soothing the baby, while he's sweeping, while he's doing laundry, while he's what, and it's these kinds of things that help men understand, wow, like that they've been kind of blind to how unequitable or just how difficult the lives of, and you know, I'm speaking to heterosexual couples here, but that tends to be the example. So it's those kind of sessions leading up to maybe, I don't know, session 8 or 9 out of 12, we really get to the financial decision making. So a couple examples of where that's practiced. We have a little learning brief from a variation on Journeys of Transformation recently completed in Guatemala with great evaluation results. Have to always give credit. The local partner in this case was a group called Global Communities. Global Communities were the implementers. That's another thing we've learned, by the way, is that the facilitator really matters. Like, you can make the most beautiful curriculum in the world, but if the facilitators themselves are not trained up well to really reflect a transformative worldview and the approach that we're taking on. But if you have a look through, it seems like they really did a fantastic job. You can see statistically significant reductions in both men's and women's agreement with kind of restrictive ideas of who should be doing unpaid work around the house, and also with ideas around that women should or can pursue careers or have a great career success as well as being a good mother. Like, significant increases in those kinds of ideas. And also the nitty-gritty, where someone asked about behavior change in addition to norm change. I always like to see this kind of a bar chart. This happens all the time, that like men give themselves way more credit than women do, even though everybody kind of agrees. So at the end line, compared to baseline, daily household work as well as daily care of children, this dark blue line, it's too small for you online to see, I'm sorry, but the dark blue line is the end line of men after the fact. And it's like quadrupled the amount of time that they're doing and everything. Not that I'm suspicious of that, but I give a little more credence to the women's assessment of whether these things are being done equally. But even there, we see almost like a 3-fold increase in who is saying that care work is being done equally, as well as some other outcomes. I was telling Melanie, this was undertaken by some of my great colleagues, Clara and Melissa. I wasn't really super involved in it, but we can help put you in touch. And the document, like I said, is over there. I've been much more involved in a Journeys of Transformation adaptation in Bangladesh. And it was exactly what you're talking about. It's within an agricultural program where again, we're taking this gender transformative approach. We're starting with what is a man, what is a woman, who does the roles, but at the end of it, the whole program is organized around bringing more gender parity into like producers groups of farmers. And it's similar to what you were saying in these family farm households in Bangladesh. Women are in the field. Women are doing all the processing of the rice after it's been harvested. Women are doing so much of the productive labor of the family farm. But when it comes to deciding when to sell, for how much, where, interacting with the buyers, where the money and power happens, it's men's role. So by the end of the program, we're building in those conversations. I don't have a neat, it's just the program only just finished couple months ago, so I don't have the perfect like brief with the outcomes. We're like desperately awaiting that, but that's kind of how it works. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That means we're all desperately awaiting it. So we'll keep a
Sure,
lookout for,
sure, yeah.
for that work. And like I want to talk about the facilitator, because I think this will tie to a little bit about what Morgan was doing in terms of seeing we outcomes, but also let's go back to sustaining those shifts. And how do we scale some of this? How do we sustain it? Can you talk a little bit about some of the results you saw and how you built in sustainability?
Okay, so I'll talk about the results.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a great question. So in both activities that I have mentioned so far, both in the DRC and Ethiopia, we did assessments and they had super positive findings. We had a Banyan team that conducted an assessment in 3 territories in the DRC, and actually that study found that the GALS approach had facilitated opportunities for women and youth to increase their engagement in agricultural value chains. The GALS approach had also helped to improve transparency and dialogue between men and women and increased women's abilities to make strategic decisions about land use and crop selection and income. The approach had supported women to have greater access to and control over income generated through their own and other family members' labor. And in fact, at the time of the assessment, almost 50% of the female GALS participants had started small businesses to generate income, and more than 50% of all GALS participants had invested in agricultural activities to strengthen their resilience. Similarly, in the case of Ethiopia, we also did an assessment and had super positive findings, but I do want to kind of skip over a little bit into the sustainability that Molly asked about, but I will point out that there's some great briefs on the table that highlight the evidence from both of those assessments. But we did want all of our work to last beyond the activity itself. So from the start, but particularly in Ethiopia, we put in some strategies to support its continued use. First, the project overall had invested in gender equality and positive youth development training for all staff that we led. There were THM modules in all of those trainings to help people better understand GESI considerations relevant to their particular technical area. At the end of the day, when we were using a THM, we had reached over 50,000 people. Second, we built the local capacity of the facilitators so that they could cascade out the transformative household methodology themselves. They all received a THM toolkits. These toolkits have an activity board, there's people cards, there's household chores cards, there's counters, and a facilitation guide that was done in 4 different local languages. It can also be done with local materials like rocks and sticks, but we did find that the updated materials really resonated with people. All of those materials are also available online. And then finally, on the last point, when the project was closing out, we actually had workshops where we continued the demonstrations of this particular household methodology approach. We encourage everyone to continue using it, continue using the toolkits. We shared the toolkits with government counterparts, local orgs, cooperatives, common interest groups, and then we also did prepare an instructional video that you'll see later that actually walks people through actually how to facilitate the activity. So we had the tools, they're all available online, but we also had a video that we were able to put together.
These are great results, and I'm glad you were able to touch on sustainability. Okay, I know that I want to add one more question, so it's gonna be fast to ask.
Okay.
And this question is your number one takeaway for attendees in the room and online. Brian.
Number one, okay, I wanted to share a little anecdote. I don't know if it's like above and beyond, but I visited Journeys of Transform. Actually, in Bangladesh, we call it Changemaker families. Like I visited a Changemaker families group in Bangladesh who had gone through the entire Journeys of Transformation curriculum and actually loved it so much they just started over and started doing it again from the beginning. But I asked them something like, you know, what's like something that we haven't talked about yet that you're really kind of fishing for most significant change or like unintended outcomes. And one dad, husband said to me, like, I look at my partner and my kids as like my friends now. I've never really thought of it that way before. And so something about like with working with families that we've never had like a whole lot of educational opportunities in the first place. These are couples who were products of arranged marriages. Like it's always been that their partnership is like a business transaction kind of. And they've never had the pathway toward more equal power. The idea that like a man would come away with it like, man, I really enjoy being friends with my partner, making decisions together. That was kind of a cool thing to hear that I didn't expect. But yeah, there's much more to add, but yeah, Morgan.
Sure. So I would say like people are coming from different levels, education or otherwise. And so when we're creating these tools to pair with the methodologies, it's really important that both the person that's facilitating the activity and the people that are receiving the activity are able to understand it. And so I think that part of working with local organizations and groups makes it so that you can develop these great tools and approaches that resonate the most and that actually can be most effective and most transformative. And so I just want to take a second to shout out to my former team members on Ethiopia Value Chain Project, who really did lead making these tools to create them in a way that was user-friendly and people enjoyed and people demanded and people wanted and were available in so many different languages. So if anyone's listening online from the team, thank you.
This was a great panel. I really appreciate you sharing your lessons, your experiences. Thankfully, in person, we have a networking hour so people can ask more questions, but we will try to take any questions from the room or online if we have any.
We do have a few online questions, but are there any questions from in the room? I'll go to online questions then. We have a few. The first one is to Brian and Morgan. Do you have suggestions for exercises or trainings for values clarification around gender norms, especially for Francophone audiences?
So the materials that we have right now for THM, I mean, they're not in French, they're in English, Oromo, Tigrinya, and one other language. That's not to say they can't be adapted. That's just that the guide happens to be written in those languages. I think that one thing that that particular activity does well is that it allows people to talk about the different roles and responsibilities within the household. A lot of times people don't really know exactly how much work the other person is really doing. So I think that the facilitation of that activity allows for conversation to open so that people can like learn more from the other family members. So I would say it can be applied, but right now I don't have anything in French.
And I hope my email is on the event, and I would just love this question asker to write to me, and because then I can email back a lot of different like curricula and resources that we have that are in French. We have work from West Africa with where through USAID and other local implementers, there are the husband schools. So we've worked to like really boost the gender transformative approach and capabilities of husband schools. We definitely have journeys of transformation in French, I'm pretty sure. And within those, you would have like a lot of different 1 hour at a time or 2 hour at a time discussion prompts and activities that I hope would get toward the values clarification you're asking about. But please write me.
And Stephanie, it occurred to me that actually we have facilitation guides from the DRC project. They're not online, but we do have tools that we did prepare during that particular activity.
So maybe for the participants online who sent in those questions, you can find Morgan and Brian's emails and they can send you resources. Do we have time for another question? All right. So another question from online, thinking about incorporating a nutrition component in THM. How do you do this, especially in low-income countries where nutrition empowerment for women is mandatory?
Okay, I actually have a good answer for this, but I need to be able to reference something real quick. So give me one moment. Because one of the other findings related to THM was about nutrition. But I definitely want to find it. This is a copy of the full brief, which is also online. The summary brief is on the table. One of the findings that we had was that we wanted to explore opportunities to further integrate youth and behavior change modules into THM. So it's not already integrated. The way the activity works is that you're talking about the roles within the household. So that could be preparing food as one of them, or home gardening as one of them. And like, what are you planting? But it doesn't specifically talk about nutrition. But we did have one of our findings and recommendations was to integrate further that as one of the options in a future iteration.
If I could also add to this person, you can also write me. I want to send you the Changemaker Family Bangladesh curriculum, because the hook of that program was agriculture and nutrition specifically. So there are activities within there that try to address, for instance, the social norm that women, moms, make all the food, serve men in the family first, then wait, okay, shoot, all the vegetables are gone, all the meat is gone, and then women only eat at the very end. In addition to what you were saying about homestead gardens, everybody's growing food at home, but they need kind of some guidance in introducing healthier vegetables, healthier fruits, like more variety. And so there is some stuff in our program about that as well. It fits right in.
For anyone who submitted a question and there wasn't time to ask it, please stay on afterwards, and also feel free to reach out to Morgan and Brian after the event as well. Well, thank you all for this fantastic panel. I think we can all see the benefits of critical reflection, male allyship, and household methodologies to challenge gender norms for advancing women's economic empowerment and gender equality. So thank you for that. And now we will shift to our second panel, which is virtual. And we have several participants. Cal Yahoon is the program coordinator for CARE's Women in Village Savings and Loan Respond Initiative, and is based in Ethiopia. And Amelie Moretti is the senior SBC specialist at Magenta and is based in Paris. And Morgan Mickle will moderate this discussion. Welcome you back to the Morgan. Welcome, Cal and Amelie.
Thanks, Morgan.
Okay, can you guys still hear me all right?
Yes. Can you hear us?
We can hear you. Thank you. And
Great.
super excited to kick off this second panel. I got to remember to look this way because that's how you guys can see me. But we do have a lot of great audience members in the room with us today. So super excited to have this discussion with you all. So first, Cal, I'm going to come to you. Coming from CARE, would love to know, oh, and just as a reminder, we're going to do a deep dive into the other two proven interventions during this panel, one of which will be a group-based collective action and learning, and the other that will be gender analyses and norms diagnostics. So Cal, how does CARE approach women's economic empowerment and social norms in its programming? And based on CARE's experiences and lessons learned, what stands out about platforms that bring women together for group-based action and learning? Over to you.
All right. Thank you, Morgan. And thank you for the Banyan team for organizing this event. So to give a bit of context for your question. So addressing gender inequality and inequity is at the heart of our programming at CARE. And models like, and I know a lot of people mentioned it earlier, models like VSLA, which is Village Saving and Loan Association, it provide collective platform to address women financial and economic empowerment. However, like layering additional elements alongside basic VSLA is really important so that we can intentionally address root causes of gender inequality. And that's also critical for the women economic empowerment piece, because even if she's not allowed to move around, to go join the saving group, even if she's saved, if she cannot have a decision over her money, the economic aspect is not going to be sustainable. Of course, every context is different, and I'm glad the landscape study also highlighted that. So conducting gender and power assessment, it is very important. That's the beginning of the work. CARE uses the gender equality framework, which includes agency, relation, and structure. And we look at addressing gender and social norm at the individual level, which is the agency, and the interpersonal level, like the relation which the women have in her household, with her community, with her significant other, and also like the structure, which is both the informal and informal institutions and policies. And we use this framework to address barriers to gender equality that is identified in the gender and power analysis. And we also have like models to address social and gender norm. One of them is the social analysis and action. It provides a collective reflection and action that the groups themselves identify different critical social norms they wanted to address, and they come up with different action that they envision that will support women and girls specifically. Currently, we follow the CARE 2030 vision, which is an overarching vision and strategy for our overall work and programming. And even in the previous visions, gender equality and women are at the center of our work. And this vision is called Harnessing Collective Power and Fighting Poverty and Collective Social Justice. And addressing gender inequality, dealing with power dynamics and injustice at the root of the vision, and in all over like the program approach, basically. And as you can see from the name, Harnessing Collective Power, it does show usually women don't have like individual power, so it's very critical to build that collective power. So group-based action in learning, it brings people, especially women, together, and it provides autonomous and independent spaces that they can decide, learn together. And it's also like VSLA specifically, we have a lot of learning that shows it's a platform for women to develop some of their communication skill, their leadership skill. So beside the financial aspect of the economic empowerment, it's also a space to build their leadership, communication, and take collective action to address different social and gender norms. And I'll give later on examples around how VSLAs are fighting early marriage, addressing GBV, creating community discussion around these critical issues. Over to you, Morgan.
Great. Thank you so much, Cal, for that overview. Amelie, I'm going to pass it to you for an overview as well. Please tell us about Magenta and what is your approach to behavioral change, and how do analyses such as gender analyses and social norms diagnostics fit into your approach?
Of course. So Magenta, for context, is a social and behavior change agency, and we specialize in understanding human behavior in order to design programming for sustainable change. So what we do is we adopt a 360 approach where evidence base is at the core of the whole process. So if you look at social norm diagnostics or gender norm analysis, it's a key part of that first step, that discover step. And briefly, how do we do it? We're going to discuss this in the coming question, but it's either we do it in the project that we implement, so at the start of the project. So for example, we're currently implementing a prevention of technology-facilitated gender-based violence in Iraq. And after having done the research informed the design, the implementation, and the evaluation. So there's 360 approach. Or another way we do it is we design a toolkit, a set of activities, so that implementing partners and stakeholders can do the analysis themselves and have the guidance to do it on their own. So for example, we did this in India on unpaid care work to support as program stakeholder to integrate unpaid care work in their analysis, but also in their programming from a gender transformative point of view. So those are two ways we do this.
Thank you so much, Amelie, for that overview. Cal, I want to pop it back over to you because you mentioned VSLAs. I also know Charla mentioned VSLAs. Brian mentioned VSLAs. What are VSLAs? What are Village Savings and Loans Associations, and how does it fit into the Care Vision 2030 strategy that you had just mentioned?
So VSLAs, and it stands for Village Saving and Loan Association. It is a self-managed group of usually between 15 to 30 individuals from very similar like community. It is primarily made up of poor rural women who meets regularly. They save money together and they also access small loans and obtain emergency funding or what we call social fund for their different needs. It builds financial and social solidarity among women and among members. Of course, like majority of our VSLA members, like 75% are women, but we also have like men in the group. So sometimes you find mixed groups, sometimes you'd find women only group, depending on the context. It started in 1991, so it's more than 30 years since we have this model. It started in Niger. Now it's become something more than just like the financial aspect of it. So space where women build their leadership and take different collective action. So VSLA is one of the proven model that is going to be scaled up as part of the Vision 2030 that CARE has. Because we've seen VSLAs as an engine. They do build economic and financial capacity of members and their groups, but also their communities. Like we've seen cases, and I'll give example later in crisis setting where group actually use some of their social fund to support their community as well. So it's just not, the benefit of it is not only contained within the groups themselves, but it cascades to their households and their community. It's also like a very critical entry point and platform to address gender and social norms. So it does help to layer other program and other implementation. And I think earlier Brian mentioned something about working with CARE, and they use like the VSLAs to add those additional dialogue about household, division of labor, and so on. And we've seen it in our different programming, like for example, like VSLAs are now the foundation for CARE's work on food and nutrition security. And this is also going to be like a platform if there is any gender or social norm around access to food, particularly affecting women and girls. The VSLA is part of that discussion as well. So they're shifting social norm wide, they're building their livelihood, and economic and financial empowerment is key to it as well. We've also tried it in emergency saving. We do have a new pilot we're doing called VSLA in emergencies, and it was piloted in Yemen, Syria, and Jordan, and it provides a bit of nexus between emergency and development programming. So it cut across our different programming, be it education, health, food and nutrition, and others. Over to you, Morgan.
Thanks, Cal. And, I think you've already touched on some about why VSLAs work, but maybe what are some outcomes that you're seeing that support advancements in women's economic power specifically? And you did touch on how VSLAs can be a platform for addressing social norms, but maybe just expanding a little bit there.
Perfect. So as the name entails, and I think it's obvious for a lot of people, it does provide like a very quick informal access to finance, right? And this mostly the women we work with they don't have access to formal financial system. They're usually unbanked. So this create a very informal and easy system for them to access a bit of loan and so on. It does build capacity around their leadership, communication, group management. They will learn, some habit around saving. They use a lot of their loans to start their own business, so they don't take usually loan like for consumption. Of course, in difficult time, they might use it to meet some of their immediate needs, but usually they start their own individual businesses or group businesses as well. In the long run, it's also like depending on their choice, it's to basically connect them with different financial services and institution. We've done a bit of a return of investment for VSLAs, and some of our data, it shows that if the group is passing at least one cycle of VSLA is usually 9 months to 12 months. So we've seen 153% increase in their saving. And this is for a group that is doing moderately well. We've also seen like increase of income, we've seen among VSLA members that the chances are like they would have at least one extra meal a day compared to people who are not in VSLAs. They experience improved health outcomes and education outcomes for their kids as well. For a typical female member who's a member of a moderately successful saving group, we've also seen the likelihood of owning an asset, and this increased by 54%. And she also have control over those assets and make decision without seeking permission from other people. And I did highlight, at the beginning where we said like it is really important to layer some of the social and gender norms that is identified through the gender power analysis, and use that, the VSLA setting as a entry point to discuss this and to address this. So if you layer this and sequence this properly, what we've seen is within the VSLA, there is a critical reflection on some of the social norm that they will address. And they are also like keep each other like accountable, right? So they will discuss this thing, they will identify what action they will take within their household and their communities, and they reflect back to the group on how they address that. A lot of the things that we've seen is like huge mobilization, and they work with some of the local government to address early marriage because this is very critical in a lot of rural areas. We've seen them discussing around, gender-based violence. Sometimes they have like, we also have like household dialogue manuals that we use in some of the countries. So husband and wife like trying to identify like different mechanism like to support their family, and the fact that she needs to be like financially autonomous, and also like seeing that the fact that she's working or having the saving, or if they share the household work, it is for the the betterment of the household. And it's also critical, it's not always husbands or men that uphold the norm. There are like mother-in-laws, there are community leaders, religious leaders that need to be like part of this discussion if we are aiming at a sustainable change. So VSLs do facilitate that, and people do trust them because they're from the community and they're seen as like a role model, especially the women leaders. They're seen as a role model because they speak out. So they have like current role to change, to shift some of the thing, but they also like they inspire younger girls in the community as well. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Cal. And I do want to come back to you in just a moment because I think that you've done some really interesting work about how VSLAs are currently pivoting. But before we go there, I want to turn it back to Amelie to talk a little bit more about her work. So Amelie, in your work, how are social norms diagnostics understood by the organizations that are reaching out to you all for support? And what are some of those key components of a gender analysis or a norms diagnostic? What are some of the guiding principles that you think are particularly critical for implementing the methodologies that you lead?
Great. So one of the first one I want to start is social norm has become this catchy term, and that at time it tends to be misunderstood for what they really are. There was a discussion earlier on what is the definition of a social norm. I would summarize it simply by saying not all social practice are social norm, and it's important to actually do research to understand if what we're looking at is actually a social norm. And I think this is one of the first challenges sometimes we face when we approach, because there's some preconception. So to help with that, I want to highlight a few components. First of all, it's to design a process, a methodology that is based on frameworks, and that frameworks will inform the research process, but also the research analysis and the tool. You can use a gender framework like the 5 domains model, but we tend to use a social behavior change framework that have a strong social norm component and gender norm component, such as the behavior drivers model from UNICEF. Some of the guiding principles that I think is important to remember is when you go into this process, please go in with this, I'm going to call it researcher mindset. That is, be curious. Don't come in with preconception of why people do what they do, and really look at it of like being open to what you're going to find. The other element is also to look at, and I'm going to use the word positive for the lack of a better word right now, but look at positive practices and positive norms that you could build upon, and not solely the bad stuff. And finally, obvious, but some concepts don't translate well in foreign languages. We could have an entire conversation on empowerment. Already from English to French, it's already a disaster. So just really be mindful that whatever research you do, that all of those key concepts translate through all of the different layers of languages. And to give you an example, we're currently doing a research in Jordan, so mixed methods on women's mobility as an agency, as a precursor to accessing education, trainings, employment, and overall well-being, and looking in particular as well at the social sanctions for breaching the expected norms around mobility. So that's what we can look at, and this will inform design. Over to you.
Thanks, Amelie. And just gonna keep with you for a moment, following on this last conversation. So you all have conducted over 20 social norms diagnostics globally. What have you seen as common social norms barriers to advancing women's economic power? And how do you explore or hone in on those particular norms?
Excellent point. So I'm going to bounce back on what some of the colleagues have already mentioned. Some of the common barriers that may be rooted in social norms relate to gender roles and women's and men's ability. We can talk about unpaid care work, looking at decision-making patterns, looking at access and ownership to assets and land, talking about inheritance, agency, and gender-based violence. Those tend to come quite often. What is important on how to own on those barriers is to look at specific research activity. And I'm really glad because it's been mentioned a couple of times. Look at the vignette structure from CARE for the SNAP. It actually breaks down very well the different component of a social norm, and that is a great tool to use to make sure that we have all of the different components. Another element is, I'm going to call it unpack, unpack, unpack. Please dig in what looks like obvious. Shame, honor, respect, private matter, bad thing will happen. Just dig into it to really understand what's behind it. I'm going to give an example from a women empowerment project in Mali, where respondent noted how men were perceived as stronger and more efficient when it comes to agricultural tasks. But at the same time, when we continue trying to explore this, what came up is that when men carried out those tasks, they received additional support. Additional community member came to help them, additional family member, or they had access to the equipment first and made it therefore, more efficient and speedier for them to do it. So this shows how you may have a perception and gender beliefs at play, but it's also important to unpack and see what is actually going on that could be contradicting and that you could leverage in programming. And finally, last point, if you have the luxury of time and your budget allows, consider a phased approach in your research. That is to go back through different stages, if you can mix in your methods, so that you give the time to learn more about the community, to get your data, to explore and to go back to dig, and especially to dig into the way the social reward and the social sanction materialize, because you might have something that you might not see the first time around. Over to you.
Thanks, Amelie. So I do recognize that we only have about 5 minutes left on our panel, unfortunately. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here. So Cal, first, I'm going to come back to you because I really want to know about how the VSLAs are pivoting. So the global environment is constantly changing. Every day, people, communities are faced with new obstacles that challenge their health, their well-being, their livelihoods. And recently, we've seen this with COVID-19. But how are global crises affecting the communities, and how are women specifically affected where CARE is operating? And what are you seeing in relation to the norm shifts, and specifically how the VSLA groups are responding to those challenges? And while you answer that question, when you wrap it up at the end, if you could throw in what your number one key takeaway is about VSLAs and why this approach works, then that would be great. Thanks, Kat. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so crisis and shocks, they pose significant challenge, and a lot of the community we work with, they're facing compounding challenges of climate change, the aftermath of COVID-19, and depending on the context, security issues and so on are like major challenges, including livelihood and food insecurity. Of course, COVID is one of global challenge. That's a very recent example, and we've seen, I think, all over internationally, we've seen women's rights taking a step back, and from safety at home, livelihood, job losses, and so on, women face those challenges more than men in different communities. And in places that we work in, because of the economic and social vulnerability of the group that we work with, the impact of this crisis are even worse. One of the things we've seen, specifically COVID was a very specific situation because of some of the restriction we've seen, like mobility for women becoming a bit difficult, safety at home. And because, even once the school opened, people start, some for economic reason, others for different reason, like girls, we've seen huge number of dropout among girl students. Early marriage was on the rise in different places as well. So I think it's very critical as we do our work when shocks and crises happen. How does they shift some of the gender norms and social norms? Even if we were seeing a positive change over the years, crises have the tendency like to set those back to some extent. So VSL is also similarly to other members. They face similar challenges around livelihood. They reported that their saving reduced, especially for COVID because of the restrictions. Some of them couldn't meet. But we also see like quick adaptation, right? Sometimes like they use different platforms, like digital platforms, like we've seen to some extent in Uganda and Nigeria. Other countries where this is not possible, we've seen like the leader of the VSLA member will go house to house collecting some money. They reduced like interest rate because they realized like, okay, people don't have the capacity to pay with interest rates. So we will waive that in this difficult time. So they use their social fund, they use their loans like to support their members. At the onset of COVID, we started an initiative called Women Respond. It was aiming at listening to women. We wanted to understand what is their, critical impact they're facing as a result of COVID, what is their priority need, and what action they're taking. And the initiative continued today, not just only about COVID, but including other crises and shocks as well. One of the things we've seen among VSL is because they have a bit of access to finance, the impact they were reporting is a bit different from those people who's not in VSLA. So they tend to report less impact around livelihood, food security, and so on. So we do see that access to finance did support in these hard times. But we've also seen they're taking a very collective action. Sensitizing communities, they took their own money, like we've seen in Niger and Burundi. They build hand washing centers for their communities. Mali and Niger, we've seen VSLA members start sewing masks and making hand sanitizers because the market was not supplying them. So they were stepping up and providing for their communities. At the same time, like we've seen like huge mobilization among VSLA members to fight gender-based violence and early marriage and so on. One of like a key example that I usually give is from Ethiopia, one of the region where we did Women Respond. When the school was open, girls were not enrolling back. And even those who enrolled, they were having a hard time. So adult VSLA members had a discussion with the Women and Child Affairs Office, the Education Bureau, and they started the schools, in 36 schools, they started a tutoring program so that, kids who are struggling with their school can catch up, particularly girls. And they went home to make sure that, every family is sending back their kids in general, but specifically girls as well. And they mobilize money to buy school materials. And these are like even non-VSLAs were contributing money so that they can buy exercise book and uniforms and so on. So we saw like a huge collective power, particularly in the pandemic, and it does continue in other shocks and crises as well. I don't have one thing I think has already been said, but I think collective power and action are critical, and VSLAs do offer that, just like any other self-help group. So people would have collective power, and women especially. So while you're thinking about the finances, but it can't just be about economic empowerment, right? It's also about social solidarity. It's also about psychosocial support. It's also about having like group level influence. So it's really important to keep the group autonomy. And I like what Amelia said, like we need to research, listen, something might shock us, but we need to go there as learners and listen what they're saying, telling to us. And we have a supportive role in the process, but they know their life more than we do. So the research part is very critical, and use that to build and sequence some of your activities around what norms do you want it to address, how they can address it. They can also envision some of the positive action, so we don't have to be the one telling them, because they, usually we call it like we assess both capacity and some of the norms they're facing, because they tell you like, we have this positive one that we can actually use. So something that is from their culture instead of like an external one being imposed. So I'll pause here. I know we're out of time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Cal. And Amelia, I'm going to turn it to you for the last word. Just in closing, your number one key takeaway about analyses and norms diagnostics, and if you can loop in maybe one example about how you're using the findings from your analyses and influencing programming, then that would be great. But let's try to keep it to less than 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Yes, so let's just give quickly one example. So let's look at research we did, and we're going to look at one driver. One driver was about this expectation of not intervene into others people's private matter even if there is violence. And it came up strongly in the research, and we decided to focus it as one of the driver in our intervention. And what we did is, in the group-based activity, we had value deliberations. And we created space to reflect on those practices because, and it relates to one question in the chat, there was a norm that was contradicting other norms that existed around watching out and taking care of each other. And through the space that we created, we were 33% of participants before the pilot that disagreed with this statement and acted on it, and we were at 88% of participants that disagreed with this idea of we don't meddle into other people's business when there is violence, and we're taking action. So there is value in doing this research and integrating into programming, and it's the same regardless of your program. One point being, all in due time, you might not be able to address all norms, and some might be too sensitive for you to address from the get-go. So this is also my final takeaway. We think we know why people do what they do. We don't always do. It's important to unpack, and let's not see it as an extra step. It is the first step. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amelie and Cal. Time one question. Okay, we'll take one question, guys, and then we will have the online space also, because I'm sure there's more. Yeah. Okay, this is for Amelie. Since norms are part of culture, how do you learn how cultural norms are related to each other, and whether there are competing norms for various situations?
Excellent question. I find that the use of vignette and different scenario allows to get those norms to come up. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight on this question is what's also important is seeing the narrative that people give to those norms, to those practices. Do they call it tradition? Do they call it culture? Do they call it religion? Because this is also important in how you're going to use it in your programming. So I think it's important to map them and see how they interplay in specific situation. And this is what you can get through vignette or through other qualitative tools, and use and take into account the narrative of the phrasing in your intervention to see what you can work on and what is more protected and need to be kept separately. Does that answer the question enough?
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm sure that we'll have some more in the online space after our concluding remarks. So at this time, I think I will pass it to our MC to carry us through.
Thank you, Amelie and Cal. I think your practical experiences, such as the VSLAs, emphasize how effective approaches at the community level, like the group-based action and learning and unpacking that you mentioned, and unpacking the, the gender barriers, the barriers to gender and social norm change, how beneficial they can be for communities to make positive changes that benefit women as well as the entire community. Well, I don't know about all of you. I could talk about these gender transformative approaches for hours, but unfortunately, we are at the closing of our event. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you our CEO, Megan Smith. She is the president and chief executive officer of Banyan Global. She has more than 20 years of experience alleviating poverty, stimulating private sector growth, improving health systems, and empowering women in developing countries across every region, as well as expertise in development finance, enterprise development, and local capacity building, which, as we discussed today, is very critical. Ms. Smith has served as the chief of party for the USAID-funded Banking on Health project, the executive director of the Sumo Foundation, and vice president and country director of the Asian Crossroads Loan Company. She has extensive experience working and living abroad. And turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'll just keep my remarks very short because I know that people want to have some time for both networking and for some online questions and answers. At Banyan Global, I think that working around social norms, integrating programming that addresses them, addresses them, is so important in terms of achieving transformation and ultimately development impact. I feel like we're all kind of at the very beginning of this, even though some of this work has been going on for such a long time now. I think that there's so much for us to still continue to learn. And I think this forum has been great in sharing some of the evidence in terms of proven approaches and some practical experience about what has worked. And so I'd really like to start off by thanking all of the presenters for your time and really sharing your expertise with us. I think you've given us all a lot to think about and to continue to discuss and see how we can be doing better programming really to achieve women's economic empowerment and to integrate work on social norms into our programming. I would also just like to say a big thank you to the Banyan Global team that worked on putting this event together, led by Morgan Mickle. I think it was a great opportunity to all come together. There haven't been that many in-person events since the pandemic, so it's really nice to see so many people in the room, but also given that we're living in this hybrid world, to be able to have people online, overseas attend as well is really kind of a nice thing. So I'd like to finally just thank all of you who have come both online and in person for taking the time to spend some time this afternoon. We're talking about this important subject. So we are going to have, for those of you in the room, we're going to have a reception now for some networking and continued conversation and some refreshments. You're welcome to, as well as please take a look at the resources over on the table. And for those of you who are online, there's an opportunity to stay on so that you can follow up with the presenters, ask any additional questions, and have some time for follow-up. So again, thank you, everyone.